Hello, everyone. How's it going? I am Katie Nichols. I am a SANS instructor as well as Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. Welcome to this month's edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. I am so happy to be joined today by my special guest, Michael Raggi, who is at Proofpoint, does a lot of awesome work there. We have tons to cover. Mike, thanks so much for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Katie. I'm super excited to be here.
Yes, and a couple logistics. First off, everyone asked this, Mike. You've been on like webinars and stuff before. Yes, this is being recorded, and you can watch it later on YouTube. So there's the first question. There's no PDF, I'm sorry, but what we will do is all the links that Mike and I talk about, we'll put that into a blog post later on. So don't worry about trying to copy and paste all of the awesome blog posts that Mike is going to talk about. We'll share that with you later. So let's do introductions first. I'm Katie. That's boring. Mike, we've known each other for a couple of years, and one of the things that made me especially trust you at the beginning is we have kind of a shared liberal arts background. So could you tell everyone who doesn't know you, what's your background? How'd you get into the cyber thing? What do you do now?
Yeah, totally. So this is probably the best party trick I have. Before cybersecurity, I got a liberal arts degree from NYU in art history, and after working in art galleries for a few years, I worked for about 2 years recovering stolen artworks for a consultancy and investigations company in New York. So I think over my 2-year run, I recovered over $11 million in stolen art by some pretty big artists that are in the MoMA and other things. So after doing that, cybersecurity just comes natural to you, right?
Of course, easy.
Yeah, of course. It's funny, I've talked about it a little bit, but I've never seen the two things to be that different, which is hard to swallow at first. It's a very technical thing. Cybersecurity and art is a very soft science, but coming at it from a cyber threat intelligence perspective, art history also has a practice of attribution. So a large part of what art historians and art librarians do is they're trying to attribute artworks to individual artists that created them. For instance, if there's a famous painting created by Michelangelo, that is a painting he created. But if all of a sudden someone rediscovers a painting by Michelangelo, research needs to be done into the materials he used, the techniques that he used, and the style that's employed in that painting to be able to attribute that to Michelangelo. So the idea of attribution was always something that I had a really good formal education in. It's just trading brushstrokes for binary and looking at the human fingerprint that's behind not an artwork, but a piece of malware or a particular intrusion. So going from art history into cybersecurity, there are principles that translate between the two.
That's fascinating, and I never thought about it that way. Attribution is attribution, right? You're associating one thing to another thing, to a human and those fingerprints. So I've never thought about it that way, and maybe we need to bring more art historians into cybersecurity, perhaps?
I'm a big supporter of that. Liberal arts kids need to do cybersecurity. We can learn a lot from them, and they bring a lot to a program, both on the strategic side and just in a different way of thinking, like a diversity of thought that is really important to supplement all of their CS degrees that they might have, computer science and whatnot. So yeah, more liberal arts kids in cybersecurity for sure.
Not that as liberal arts kids we're biased or anything, but no, yes.
Not at all.
So tell us a little bit, you're on the Proofpoint team now. What do you do there? What's your focus?
Sure. So my official title is Senior Threat Research Engineer. I'm part of a research team responsible for identifying APT threat actors in Proofpoint customer data. So I run the China program and work with incredibly talented analysts that cover Iran, DPRK, as well as Russia. And then we have a lot of emerging geographies as well that we spend a lot of time identifying APT threat actors in. So the main role is really hunting data in our customer set to protect our customers, identify interesting campaigns, set up detection for those tools and techniques being used by those actors so that if they come back, we're finding it and blocking it before they even have a chance to get up and running. And then finally, extracting the human stories from those campaigns to share them with customers and the broader community to allow for protection, but also give them the idea of why is this important? Why should they care? that they were targeted by a shadowy government organization from across the planet.
Focusing on that, so what? Who cares? So, yeah, I saw one of this recent blog posts that you created on this RTF template injection technique. We'll bring that up, and this is something you can check out. We'll share the link later. Which it seems like a little bit of a complex technical technique, but really important because a lot of adversaries are using it. So for someone maybe who is an art historian or wants to do journalism or isn't from a super technical malware analysis background, at a high level, what is this technique?
Sure. So RTF template injection is what the technique came to be called after we identified it and compared it to historic research. So at its most basic, RTF is a file type that exists for word processing in the way that a Microsoft Word document file exists. But it's a file format created by Microsoft to have cross-platform support for Word files, so word processing files. So if you're on Mac, if you're on Linux, this file type was created to allow you to be able to open this RTF file without having a disruption to the format of the RTF file regardless. So it's platform agnostic in that way. Basically, this file structure has the ability to specify a document template destination that you can embed a URL in, and when you open that RTF file, you're unknowingly redirected to a remote URL which can pull back a malicious payload. So it's subverting a legitimate functionality intended to be used for fetching a document template file on your local host or a network host. But threat actors have figured out that the file type actually supports URLs for remote delivery of any file really, but malicious files in this case for RTF template injection.
So kind of the same sort of theme we've seen of adversaries taking advantage of legitimate, built-in things in Microsoft Word, like macros. But basically, as I'm looking at the blog post, right, the ability to retrieve things using some remote URL that's embedded in that RTF file, right?
Yeah, so in 1987, it seemed like a really good idea to create these plain text file structures that can be moved to Linux or Mac so that they never change. But threat actors learned that basically hard-coded is the ability to go out and fetch these malicious things that the user is not even going to notice in most cases when they're open. So as the internet has become a more malicious place to exist in, I think subverting legitimate functionality is the threat actor's bread and butter as time goes on.
Absolutely. And so when did you first start seeing this technique? Because you said 1987, like, I don't know if we were alive in 1987. I was doing cybersecurity in 87. But when did you first start seeing this? How did you figure out what these adversaries were doing?
So I want to start by just saying that I think this is a technique that has been in use for a while, not years on end, but as early as January, it was written up by a security researcher named Fareed Fauzi. Us personally at Proofpoint began seeing it at the beginning of Q2 2021. I have to get my years right because I've lost.
Years are hard because it's still 2020, right? I don't know.
It took me a minute. But basically, we identified a malicious downstream artifact from the execution of an RTF file. So we see a lot of template injection as phishing attachments. We see a lot of macros used in phishing attachments. But from that, you're able to have detection signatures for behavior. So a heuristic signature that says RTF file opened and URL resulted from that. So that particular thing we see often in the case of embedded objects, or if it's a Word document, something like a remote template. So we were expecting to see a technique like we've seen thousands of times before. What we saw instead was a new technique to us that we had undersigged at the time. We caught it behaviorally, but we did not specifically have it labeled as RTF template injection. And that caused us to say, weird, I didn't know RTF files could do this. And it sent us down a pathway to look at the malware that was delivered, look at the victimology that's being used, and then hunt across our broader data set to say, is this the only case of this being used? And we were really surprised to find that we really only saw 3 APT actors using it. And it's APT actors we knew about, that were on our radar, that we track regularly. So it was kind of an eye-opener to say, why is there no cybercrime using this? Why is there no lower level activity, this seems to be at this echelon of threat actor activity where it's still percolating and possibly something we might be able to intervene on before it gets widely adopted in the threat landscape.
That's pretty interesting. And I love the kind of the methodology you described there. I think this is so important that whenever an analyst first sees something interesting, like this is how all amazing research starts, is by an analyst being like, this seems weird. Like, are there patterns? You mentioned like looking at patterns, for malware across victims and then piecing things together. And that's one thing I always say to my team is like, if you're seeing something happening one place, like chances are pretty good it's happening somewhere else, or like other people are seeing it. And so it can be really fun to kind of try to piece that together and look for patterns. That's one thing I love about being an analyst, honestly.
Yeah. In this case, it was really funny because I work with the smartest people I know, which is really cool. So of course, Teams chat, I'm like, have you seen this? Like, you must have seen this. And everybody had the same thing, like, oh, I wouldn't write that signature in that way. It's got to be really common. And when we started to look, we're like, this isn't common. And it turns out it's being used by a fairly exclusive group. So it's helpful to just kind of scratch your head and look at somebody else that's pretty smart and say, hey, is this something you're familiar with or that I don't know about? So collective knowledge in that way is really helpful when starting down the path of something like this.
Absolutely. So scrolling through this blog post, which everyone can absolutely come read, and we'll link to it later. What's this first, right? What's the takeaway here for the document formatting properties? Why is that important to this technique?
So the cool thing about RTS is how flexible they are. So I mentioned before that basically hard-coded in the strings of an RTF file is the formatting way that it's going to appear when you open it. So you have the ability to specify things like available font families, object sizes, image sizes that are embedded in it. And this is to make sure that it appears the same way across any platform you open it on. With that being said, in the plain strings of a file, you have the ability to actually manipulate the formatting properties of an RTF file. And historically, this has been used maliciously to do a lot of interesting things around object file embedding. So a lot of times you have the ability to actually embed a malicious file within an RTF and specify the file contents through the structure in just the strings. In this particular case, there's no malicious content in the file itself. The malicious content is delivered by a URL that you're able to include in the template field. So at the bottom there, we have highlighted this RTF template destination. And there's a couple of different types of destination control words, they're called. So any formatting word that's in the RTF is a control word, and a destination control word is something that goes and fetches something else, either from your local host or from a different part of the formatting structure in an RTF. So in this case, template is specifically designed to fetch a file. But threat actors learned you can actually just put a URL in there and it'll go out and get your URL contents instead.
Gotcha. So this is really kind of the property in the RTF where you all had to focus to look for these remotely hosted payloads, right?
Yeah. So a cool thing about RTF files is if you pull it up on VirusTotal or in a hex editor, it literally is just plain text strings. That's kind of how I got into RTF files in the first place. How do you go from art to cybersecurity? You pick one thing that seems easy, and RTF files to me were that easy thing because you could just dump the strings out of them and you're reading the actual structure of that file without having to understand how to convert binary or anything like that. It's plain text strings. So in this case, you're combing through the strings to be able to identify that specific template field. So bracket slash asterisk slash followed by a template. And usually it's supposed to have a file structure. Instead, these have URLs. So if there's a URL following a template field, that's a pretty good indication it's supposed to be suspect because that's already stretching the intended functionality of an RTF file.
I just saw you linked in your blog post to the version 1.5 specification for RTF. I wanted to highlight this because often like looking at this kind of documentation is not super glamorous, but I found that's how you understand this stuff, right? Like understanding the different properties and how an RTF is created. Like that's not as exciting as, attributing to some APT groups, but it's kind of an important building block here. So reading documentation, I think, is a great way right? To start to understand this stuff, even if you're not like a technical person, whatever you can learn, you can read.
And that page specifically is one of my favorite on the internet. It was written in 1997 and it looks like it. Like
There's a butterfly. It's great.
Updated. It has a real like Netscape quality that makes me feel like I can master the internet still. It's not too big for me.
A little bit of a throwback. I like it. So we have like some scary code here, right? This sounds like this is just what you were talking through, right? So like we don't have to get intimidated if we don't know bits and bytes, right? It's right there on the right. It was exactly what you're talking about. It's in plain text. That's the nice thing about RTF, as you said, right?
Yeah, it's Control F for that template field value, and you're able to start poking around and seeing where this URL might be in the structure of it. In this particular example, it's really cool. So I mentioned destination fields. So there's a lot of different destination fields in an RTF file, and all of them are capable of embedding this template field within that control word group. So something between two brackets is a destination, and it has a designation as specified by that asterisk. And you can hide that template field in another existing destination field. So Selena on our team loves to say she's going to do this in the Comic Sans font field. So that Comic Sans is the malicious artifact being secretly and hilariously malicious in the context of a file. But it's really cool the way different threat actors have made different sartorial decisions about where they want to try and hide this in a file. And that's helped us a little bit on the attribution side, figure out maybe who's using it.
Interesting. So talk to me a little bit about the attribution piece. So you have a really nice timeline. I'm a huge fan of any graphics that are beautiful. And I like this one because you can pretty clearly see these different groups when they've used it. So what's the summary? Like how many different groups? How'd you identify these groups?
Sure. So we identified 3 separate APT actors that were attributable to known actors in the landscape that we track both internally and that the larger community at large has tracked as well. So the earliest adopter of this tool in an APT context we were able to identify was the Do Not team. This is a group that's believed to be associated with the Indian state interest. Other researchers have published really good research on it that we were able to link to. And their geopolitical orientation tends to be targeting regional adversaries of India, specifically in defense and governmental organizations. So in the case of the Do Not activity, we began to see campaigns around April. So April 2021 is when we saw campaigns, but when we started, and those are campaigns that are phishing campaigns that have an attachment, which is an RTF file that uses this RTF template injection technique. So that's how we're identifying it. And as we were beginning to really dig on the delivery infrastructure used, the C2 infrastructure used, the domains used to send the actual emails, we were able to determine that they began planning their attack in the March time period. So that's when the domains got registered. That's when the services got associated with the servers or the IPs that were hosting those domains and services. So weaponization seems to have started in about March. I think subsequently, outside of our data, we were actually able to determine that it was a little earlier that documents were in play. So maybe February or so, open source documents were there. And a really great security researcher, Rafa Pedrero, published a piece on samples that were circulating in Twitter and whatnot, as well as those campaigns. Following those campaigns, at around the same time period in April, we observed TA423. So TA423 is a threat actor that we correlate with a Proofpoint internal name, Leviathan, which has been written about. They've been the subject of a Department of Justice indictment. And we saw them utilizing RTF template injection attachments in phishing campaigns with a very specific geographic focus, which was primarily Malaysia and the Oceania region, with an interest in deep water energy exploration.
So jumping in here a little bit on the naming stuff, right? Because you mentioned the Do Not team named by another team, and then TA, which is the Proofpoint naming scheme. I love group naming. Anyone who's watched this knows that. Could you tell me what led you to use Do Not team for one group and then use your own TA name for another group?
Yeah. And this is going to harken back to the GCTI SANS course, hardcore. I feel like Rob.
We didn't pay you to say that. We did not pay you to say that, by the way.
I'm going to quote heavily from my notes from that particular presentation. So in this particular case, Proofpoint refers to threat actors that we track with the TA designation followed by 3 numbers. In this particular case, TA 423 has some parity with groups referred to as Leviathan or APT 40. However, we have additional context within our data on an operator team level gleaned from phishing email headers that allow us to track teams operationally down to a level of operations that's different than the data that might exist at a Mandiant or at a iDefense or at a Microsoft, based on the largely endpoint, or in the case of Microsoft, everything point data that they're able to correlate there. So in this particular case, we were not able to create parity with the actual samples or campaigns that were identified. So in that instance, we track this group internally as TA423 and recognize that there is some overlap with groups referred to as APT40, Mudcarp, Gadolinium, I believe is the Microsoft name for it as well. In the case of a do not group or the Gamma-Redin group, we were able to, based on what was observed in our data and based on what was published in open source, correlate actual campaigns, C2 domains, and samples to what has been talked about elsewhere. So we were able to create parity between what the industry is calling do not team and what we have an internal TA number for, but we're also calling do not team in our publication. So it's not always useful to just slap our TA number on top of another group if it's publicly known and written about elsewhere. So when we can create one-to-one parity, that is our ideal goal, to provide a clearest picture possible. But I'm not going to write a blog in which says, oh, this is Mudcarp or APT40 or Gadolinium, when I don't fully understand the full universe of how those teams intend to define that definition in the space. So that's our thinking in this context.
Yeah, and this is a source I really like, Malpedia, just showing some of those names and reporting. And I've talked about this in a previous webcast in this series. I love that though, right? If it's the same as what someone else is calling it, just use their name, do not team. When you have a different way of tracking it, use your own group name. I feel like this is something that rarely happens. So it just, I don't know, to my Intel nerd heart, like we got some folks in the comments as well who are Intel nerds. So we appreciate that.
We're seeing the tweets, guys. We're seeing the no more threat actor name tweets. We see them, we hear them, we do our best to agree with them. But in this particular case, just make sure that you have samples that are correlating with campaigns before trying to use somebody else's name. I try to be as respectful as possible and credit every researcher with the work they're doing, because it really is the foundation for the work that I'm doing, trying to correlate these things. And that was kind of the interesting part about the Gamma-Redin attribution that we were working in. We saw them in early October pick up this technique seemingly for a single day of attachments. So we didn't see them using this technique before nor after. We picked it up as part of a cluster of document injection, the Word document template injection files, and XML template injection files. It seems like this was a technique that they were dusting off, trying to see if this might fit into their particular TTPs and methods for phishing. But it allows us to correlate actual C2s and URI structures with previous signatures we had through our emerging threats team to say this is a one-to-one match for what is known to be Gamma-Redin by the community and what has been published to be Gamma-Redin by the community previously. So someone published great Gamma-Redin research. There was the same C2s in it and the same URI structures that we previously developed signatures on. And based on that publication, we were able to develop that attribution in a very high confidence to call it that. So whenever there is public research on activity, referring to that and then correlating both with what you're seeing and what has been written previously is a major part of the attribution practice.
Love that so much. So kind of zooming out, looking at some of the comments. First off, we have people from different places. New York, I'm kind of jealous of our South Carolina person. We had Christian commenting that, and I like this approach, any computer system we know of is basically a text replacement system. And that's why like the potential for injecting malicious contents is always going to be there. It won't disappear. And I like that, right? There's so many different ways to inject malicious contents, but computers are text replacement, which makes it also easier to just do Control F to find things, find weird things. So I like that comment. All right. Okay, so we talked about different groups, right? We got TA423, Do Not Team, Gamma Readin, which Gamma Readin was in October. So this is like pretty darn recent that this stuff was happening, right?
Yeah, and we've seen campaigns since of these actors in the wild, specifically TA423 continues to be very active until recently using this technique. We have not seen Gamma Readin kind of continue with it. It seems like they might not have liked it very much and have kind of moved on from it since. I don't want to rule out that they're going to again. But yeah, there was some interesting interplay between the methodology of the teams embedding the specific control word that speaks a little bit to how threat actors might adopt tools in general. In the case of the TA423 group that we believe to be aligned with China, this particular template control word was continuously embedded into a font field. Sometimes it was Times New Roman, sometimes it was a different field. So in this particular case, we saw it being embedded in that font field with consistency across multiple campaigns and in all of the samples we observed in our data and publicly. So it seems like this is a native capability utilized organically by this threat actor. In the case of the Do Not team, believed to be associated with Indian state interests, we saw them embed this in a completely different section of the RTF. And I'm going to get this wrong probably, but the WGFFMT filter section, which is a mouthful. But
that thing, I highlighted it on the screen. It's that.
That you can copy and paste, and I'm not going to say it again. Basically, that's a section that allows you to specify what internal file formats are going to be selectable when you open a file in Microsoft Word. So if you want a document template, you specify in the RTF, these are the templates available in that field. It's a destination field. So that means you can squirrel away one of these template redirect URLs in the file structure that allows you to pull down a malicious URL resource.
So just the fact of where they embedded these URLs in the RTF, like helped speak to like a human fingerprint, that's what kind of allowed you to cluster these differently. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so it was a human choice to do either a font family or in this particular filter field. And it's interesting because in the case of the Do Not team, they decided to use encoded characters, specifically Unicode 16-bit characters. Long story short, you can include these different formats in RTF, and the RTF will read them as if they were ASCII characters when it's rendered, calling out to the URL. But if you're Control Fing or reading it with your eye, it's harder to identify in an analysis standpoint. So that field, the filter field, is supposed to include hexadecimal values to represent those templates. So the Do Not actors may have replaced it with a similar looking set of characters because it anticipates a hexadecimal value. Instead, you're putting this 16-bit Unicode value. To the naked eye, it's hard to spot like what just looks like technical jargon when you're reviewing a file as legitimate. Here's the kicker. When Gamma Readin started using it, they also included it in that same field. But they didn't use any encoded structure around it. They just included the same simple ASCII URL characters. So I'm not suggesting that these groups have a shared supply chain or that they're attributed to the same actor. What I'm suggesting is they may have seen these open source files, which were already published by security researchers at this time, and tried to replicate that capability, try it out in their arsenal, and see if it would work for them. I can't say for sure, but the fact that they're both there in the same exact control word group stuck out to me as a commonality that was hard to ignore.
Interesting. And on the kind of tracking clustering note, we had a question coming in. How do you start to track campaigns? Like maybe this started with one or two suspicious emails. And maybe the broader question is, how can people do this kind of correlation? Like, was it just a person who saw this? Like, are you consistently recording data, right? How did you figure out and start to cluster these campaigns?
Sure. So I've always used a bit of a rule of four. Before you want to call something a threat actor cluster or ID, it's really hard to find one campaign and say this is the whole universe of data unless you can correlate it with open source activity. I'd say four intrusions or four phishing campaigns. You get four emails across four time-bounded dates. You then have a cluster of information to look at. And if those four things share specific TTPs, they share infrastructure. If you look at the diamond model and you start looking at those four things together and they all share different diamond model mapping overlaps, you might want to start clustering that into a threat activity cluster. From there, you'd be able to find higher level attribution over time if you're seeing TTP shift, but some things remain in place, like infrastructure, like phishing infrastructure, like certain coding or scripts being utilized with consistency. You have the ability to take those individual campaigns and then compare those to other campaigns to start calling it a threat actor activity cluster. And then ultimately, you have to develop high confidence and compare to others in the field who are seeing similar activity before you're able to take this sort of report public. So that's really our job on the APT team, is not just spotting this, but developing with a level of confidence that we feel comfortable going to the community with, that we can stand behind and say, protect yourself from this thing, this name that is usually made up and has been called 10 things before that name really made it public. So yeah, that's always what we try to do internally, is start small, build on that, and then with increasing levels of confidence, get it to a point where we can go public with a level of confidence that you can all go to your leadership and feel comfortable with.
You just described like the entire CTI process in a nutshell. And I'm sure that's all really easy. And you just like happen to find this quickly one day, right? No, this just takes months, right? To correlate and pull together.
Yeah, when I say temporally bounded, I mean like, okay, so like mid-February to June is like a temporal boundary, and then you gotta go figure out if that matches sectors and what customers, and it's an art. It's an art and a science, and I don't know, my liberal arts brain likes that part of it quite a bit. Hopefully the technical people do too.
For the technical people, we had a question about Yara, which, fun fact, the creator of Yara says it stands for yet another ridiculous acronym or recursive acronym. So that was the creator of Yara who said that. So you have some Yara rules down here. As you know, liberal arts kid, me too. Did you write these? How did you figure this out? Like, how could someone try to create these?
So yeah, I did write these, and I'm sure you could tell because if the creator of Yara really wanted to crucify me for efficiency, he would have the capability to do it, because I'm using the RTF designation bytes as a string instead of specifying it as a byte condition at the bottom, which is the correct way to do it. But the real way to get started with Yara is like anything, with the Yara documentation. And VirusTotal also has really great Yara documentation. It has the capability to be incredibly flexible, but at its most simple, you're matching strings against a file. So we're just searching for specific strings in either plain text or byte format, and then setting a condition by which that rule matches. So in this case, all this rule is basically saying is we want this to have the RTF bytes, so actual RTF file bytes that specify a structure at the 0 offset in a file. The most famous example is MZ, is the PE header. So that's always going to be at the beginning of a PE file. And all we're saying is we also want this RTF template string, the brace / asterisk / template, followed by HTTP, also covers HTTPS, to occur in a single file. And RTF files, like I said, are plain text strings. So these are really good candidates for experimenting with Yara and seeing if you can identify malicious patterns. Things like specific objects or object types within an RTF file are very good fits for Yara signatures as you're just getting started. If you're lucky enough to have a VT Enterprise account, throw them in VT and learn from your mistakes, because very quickly you'll start getting a ton of emails that you don't want to see. It forces you to get good at it quick for your own sanity, just to be able to get better at writing more efficient rules that don't false positive all over the place.
Yeah, so for anyone who isn't familiar, a virus total enterprise paid subscription, right? You can put in Yara rules and then it can search retroactively or in real time. And so I'm going to guess that maybe you've done this, like I've done this. I'm going to write a Yara signature on malware and I'm going to look for all the things that come in. And then you get bombarded, as you said, and you're like, all right, let me do better. The other thing I wanted to mention, we talked about documentation and how searching documentation isn't really that exciting. But right, like if you look at a Yara rule and you're like, what the heck is ASCII no case? Like search the documentation. I know it's not exciting, but like I feel like sometimes we get intimidated by like, oh my gosh, like Mike knows everything about Yara rules. I can't possibly learn. But like everyone at one point probably read the documentation or had someone explain it to them. So I just wanted to mention that one.
And I still read the documentation all the time, especially when I'm going to put rules public. I want to make sure we're not breaking stuff for all of you guys trying to use it. So the documentation's your friend, and I use it on a daily basis. You're never too old for documentation.
Truth. So kind of wrapping up on this note. So the outlook, right? If you were to give us anticipatory intelligence, I don't say prediction, that's for fortune tellers, right? Anticipatory intelligence. What's the outlook for this technique and its use?
Sure. So I think we can look back historically at some precedents set in RTF techniques that were malicious in the past, things like embedded objects, and also at the success of template injection for Word documents. I think it's plausible that threat actors might be able, similar to a context that Gamma Redden found, see this technique and think, wow, that's actually really easy to replicate with just a Word editor, Microsoft Word, and a hex editor to insert malicious URLs. So I think it's possible at the lower end of cyber criminal activity, we might see an adoption of this technique to broaden the outlook for phishing activity. This is not a vulnerability or a new tool that's going to revolutionize a threat actor's capability to do badness. I think it's an additional tool on their tool belt to possibly try to evade detection levels and possibly email gateways to hopefully increase their efficacy in delivering phishing. So for 2022, I'd say be on the lookout for this technique in cyber criminal campaigns, specifically in a phishing context. We haven't yet observed a precipitous increase in its use, but we are seeing people play around with it after we've talked about it. So hopefully this serves as the basis to kind of up your protection against it, as well as keep an eye out for it in the new year should people start picking it up.
And we've mentioned the word technique quite a bunch, so we haven't talked about MITRE ATT&CK yet. I think one thing that's good to do is, right, have a common language. And you kind of mentioned how like this approach and like text replacement and putting things in Microsoft Office isn't necessarily new. So, this might sort of fall under this attack technique. What do you think? As you all started looking for, hey, can we map this to attack? Does that work?
So I personally did not believe that it worked. And I think that this template injection technique in attack is very, very good at a high level technique, capturing docx, XLX, and PPX, so PowerPoint, Excel, and doc formats using template injection, as well as some of the XML formats. I think those fundamentally function different from RTF template injection. So I wrote to MITRE ATT&CK to submit hopefully a sub-technique for RTF template injection so that in the future they can consider whether or not they want to carve this out into a sub-technique or accommodate it as part of the template injection technique. It is bringing a new attack surface to template injection that previously was not well documented, although possible. So maybe in the future we'll have our very own sub-technique for RTF template injection, but that is for the gods of MITRE to decide.
I love that. And of course, I was on the attack team before, but just wanted to point out, right, this is the kind of thing when you're like, hey, I have this technique. How does it fit into attack? Maybe it doesn't, or you're not sure. Like, you can contribute to attack. There's the contribution page. So sharing is caring, as I always like to say.
And they're great. They are the smartest, kindest people who love to chat about techniques. So reach out to them. Agreed.
Not just because I used to be on the team either. Cool. So we talked a bunch about RTF template injection. What else are you all doing? Like Proofpoint blog, it is lit up with good stuff. What are you working on? What are your teammates working on?
This is one of the best parts of my job, is getting to see the process of the Threat Insight blog and team do their work. It is an incredible team of analysts, not just APT analysts, cyber criminal analysts, business email compromise analysts doing really cutting edge work. In some ways, BEC and crimeware is more cutting edge than APT on some days, which is really cool to see. But we have incredible research coming out on different bankers, Trojans being used in the threat landscape, geographic campaigns that target specific sectors, business email compromise, and some telephonic phone phishing that's been occurring. APT research recently has covered what we call TA406 and TA427, which is North Korean DPRK, Kimsuki, and Kony research. All of these I highly recommend at the Threat Insight page, and I can't say enough kind things about all of my analysts that work with me. It's really a talented team and a fun place to go to work every day.
That's all that any of us can hope for. And yeah, I really appreciate what your team has been sharing with the community. And Mike, appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. Anything else we should talk about before I let you go?
I think we covered it. And thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for reading Proofpoint stuff, and we'll keep at it. We'll keep telling you guys what to be concerned about and how to protect yourselves against it.
Thanks so much, Mike. Have a great rest of your day and have a great holiday if I don't see you.
Happy holidays.
All right. As we let Mike get back to his day, got some requests in chat for what are we going to talk about next. And yes, I'm going to use these Chrome tab groups, which I absolutely love. If you've never used this, you can just minimize one group. And so we're wrapping up RTF template injection. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I specifically didn't talk about this to start because there are other threats happening, but obviously big news, of course, last week's Log4j vulnerability that came out. I'm not going to rehash everything about it because there are some amazing blog posts, everything out there, but basically Log4j, it's a logging library in Java. It is used to log things, and why it's so scary is this same library is used in a whole bunch of software, a lot of places. That's the TLDR. And what's kind of worrisome, right? The initial vulnerability came out, and then Tuesday, I don't know about you all, but I was catching up and cool, we're going to be okay. And then it was found that first vulnerability, right? The update didn't quite complete the fixes. And so a second vulnerability came out. That said, from folks I trust, right? This one is sort of just completing and making sure it's fully remediated for now. Not quite as bad because it requires a specific configuration. So not quite as bad as the first, but the big change was now you got to update to Log4j version 2.16.0, not 15.0. So that's a vulnerability side. Right? I don't know everything about this vulnerability. I rely on really smart people that I work with, as you all should, and smart people across the internet. But what I wanted to focus on today is a threat piece, right? I'm an Intel analyst. I care a lot about threats. And this is something that I say over and over again, but it's so important. So I'm going to say it again. A vulnerability is just a flaw in the code, right? For bad things to happen, a threat has to exploit that vulnerability. Why does that matter? Why do I keep saying this? Well, as analysts, as CTI analysts, right, those of you and myself, we should be thinking about what threats are exploiting this vulnerability. Because if we can try to catch those threats, right, they're not just going to stop at the exploitation of that vulnerability. Right, they exploit it, cool, they get on one box, but if they want to steal my information, if they want to move laterally, if they want to do all of those other things in attack, they have to do something else. And so this one in particular, right, there's a lot of debate. How should we detect it, mitigate it? Best mitigation, update to 2.16.0. If that isn't in your cards, right, you can have other partial mitigations. But I would argue no security tool is going to completely protect you fully until you're patched and updated. And so, right, we have to do this thing of defense in depth. And I know these concepts are boring, right? This idea of a kill chain, nothing happens in a vacuum. But I feel like when we're the most panicked and when we're all freaking out a little bit because this is a really widespread vulnerability, that's when we go back to basics and remind ourselves of the importance of things like having an inventory, right? What third parties do we rely on? Not just needing a software bill of materials, but as a very smart person, Katie Masouras said, let's start with an inventory. What software do we even use before we can figure out if that software uses Log4j. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the threats, some things that I've seen, some recommendations, some sources that I really like, right? And Stephen, thank you so much for linking to the earlier webcast on Log4j earlier in the week. Some of my really smart colleagues at SANS talked much more about the vulnerability itself. Rely on smart people. You don't have to know everything. But I did want to share a couple things that I've been looking at and that I've been relying on for tracking the threats. So the team over at Curated Intel, and there are a bunch of folks in the community, I'll show some of them, who've done a great job of trying to crowdsource information. This is one that I like. Folks at Curated Intel have tried to bring together different sources, indicator feeds, IOCs, if that's your thing. But what I'm focusing more on is this threat report section down here. Now, really, really important. Again, anytime that something big like this happens, something big comes out, there's a tendency, everyone panics, and we want to get information wherever we can. Don't forget the importance of validating and vetting sources. There are a lot of really great people on Twitter who are sharing info. That's awesome, but if it's someone you don't know, maybe don't trust that until you've verified or validated via other sources. Growing up, someone probably told you, right, don't talk to strangers, don't trust strangers. Like, same thing still applies. Validate and vet your sources. Don't just see something and be like, oh, someone on the internet said it, so it must be true. So that said, right, team at Curated Intel is compiling different threat reports about threats that are exploiting these vulnerabilities, which again, great place to look for. And what you're going to start to see is that a lot of the threats exploiting this are things that this community already knew about. Kinsing, botnets like Mirai, crypto miners, our favorite Cobalt Strike, which tons of awesome people have talked about detecting Cobalt Strike, which is used by adversaries and red teams, right? Other things in here, of course, everyone's concerned about ransomware. I would say we're rightly concerned about ransomware. There's a report from Bitdefender that came out about a Consari ransomware. It's probably in this list somewhere. There it is. And so this was one of the first reports that I saw mentioning ransomware. And so I'm like, okay, need to take this seriously. We are all very concerned because this vulnerability is so widespread. Could ransomware actors start exploiting this, which is a reasonable thing to be concerned about based on past patterns. And so if you took a look at this, right, this blog mentions Mustick botnet, coin miners like XMRig, and then this new ransomware family, Consari. So really important to read these things. Whenever you see like a summary in something like, you know, a news reporting site, I always look for what's the original source. So like if it's a news report talking about Bitdefender, just go read the Bitdefender blog. And when you do, right, it says for these attacks, we have detected the attempt to deploy a ransomware family called Consari. Keywords here to me are attempt to deploy. Yes, this is serious. But this is saying what they saw at the time of publication was an attempt to deploy, not successful widespread deployment. That might have changed since then, but really important to take the time to read these sources. And someone in comments noting, I'm a stranger. I know, so maybe you shouldn't even trust me. That's why I'm showing you all these other sources. So you can look at these sources yourself, decide what you think. And if you disagree with my assessment, that's totally cool. Right, looking at different sources. So Consari ransomware, really big concern right now. The team at Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, this is a team I trust. Microsoft has some pretty freaking awesome visibility. And they just updated, I don't even know what day it is. Was this yesterday, today? I don't know. But they updated this talking about Consari ransomware, adding to what Bitdefender put out. Microsoft said they can confirm they've seen Consari ransomware being delivered as a payload post-exploitation, right? They say, and this, you know, take it for what it's worth, right? We have observed in Microsoft Defender antivirus data a small number of cases of this being launched from compromised Minecraft clients. So my sense of this is maybe not super widespread, but we don't know for sure. Everyone has different visibility. What this does tell us is that, yeah, there's attempts to deploy this ransomware. It looks like it has been delivered based on Microsoft visibility. So this is something we should be tracking. We should be looking at. That said, I haven't seen a ton of widespread talk of mass ransomware as a result of this vulnerability. Is that a possibility? Certainly. And that's why I think it's important to take this seriously. Everyone also likes to ask about state-sponsored actors, APTs, and Microsoft added some context in here about certain state-sponsored actors they've seen, including Phosphorus, suspected Iranian actor, and Hafnium, suspected Chinese-based group that you might recall from March when there was mass exploitation of an exchange vulnerability. Yeah, that was in this year. I know it was March 2020, guys. 2020 is almost over, or 2021. I don't even know what year it is. So it's been a long year, 2 years, etc. But great post from Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. They're continuing to update that, which is cool. On the ransomware side, right, also access brokers. We know ransomware, there's kind of an initial access affiliate, and they'll pass it off to the ransomware actors who encrypt. So we've seen some initial access brokers there. That's concerning as well. But one thing to point out here, mass scanning, right? From when this first came out Thursday night into Friday, people scan the internet like heck, right? And the people scanning were both, I would say, good people and bad people. There were security researchers who were scanning, who were trying to figure out who's vulnerable, so maybe I can let them know. There were also adversaries scanning, right? I know kill chain's boring, but reconnaissance is the first stage of the Lockheed Martin TM cyber kill chain. And scanning, that's how a lot of the recon starts. That said, based on what I've heard from a lot of people around the community, it seems like right now, at least before we started this webcast, that there was a lot more scanning than there was successful post-exploitation activity. So if there's anything that maybe makes us feel better, maybe it's that. That said, my concern and others who have similar feelings, right, we're concerned that this could get worse, right? Especially if people don't patch this vulnerability because it's so widespread. Other sources I do trust, right? DHS CISA, they've started to crowdsource things. They're updating, right? I know a huge point of confusion has been what freaking versions are vulnerable or not. And so going to Apache's documentation, that's the best approach to take to trust which versions are known good, which have vulnerabilities. They give you the technical details, and then DHS is also kind of rounding up different blog posts. Again, I'm not saying all of these are 100% correct. I'm saying these are great places to start. Another post that I would recommend looking at is one from Mandiant. They put this out at some point during this week that's all running together. So John Holtquist, and he gave credit on Twitter to his colleague Matthew McWhirt for doing most of the work. Typical boss behavior, right? You just put your name on it. I'm just kidding. I love you, John. This is a really detailed blog post, and Mandiant talks about how they've also seen activity from suspected state-sponsored actors out of China and Iran. So they give a little bit of info there. Really great background here. One question that some people have asked, right? This JNDI injection that's made possible by this vulnerability can use different protocols. So a lot of the threat reporting we're seeing out there is around LDAP, but there are other protocols that can be used like RMI, DNS, etc. Here's another summary of the versioning. So I know this is stressful. A lot of people worked over the weekends. If you upgraded, you probably had to upgrade again after that second vulnerability, which sucks. So hug your system administrators. That's really, really important. But some really good, solid guidance here about, okay, let's scope how bad this is, identify where we could be using Log4j, what third parties we're using who we need to reach out to and ask them if they're using Log4j. Other resources, there are tons of good ones. NCSCNL is compiling software that might be affected by this vulnerability. Again, I think DHS CISA has a similar list. There are a few lists floating around there. And what I always recommend, as you can see, and why I like this one, is they link to the original source. And so if you're running any of these software packages in your environment, right, this might be a great place to go and go find out from the source, what are they doing? Have they remediated? Are they vulnerable? Because, right, we all rely on third parties, software or services or cloud providers sometimes. So that's a great source. And again, this is being recorded, and I will compile all the links and we'll throw those into a blog post. Someone kindly posted a link to that. So we'll share all of these later. So you don't have to try to copy and paste or like OCR the screen or anything. A couple other folks I wanted to call out, because there's been a lot of great community work around this, is the folks at Gray Noise. So They are a commercial entity, but their founder, Andrew Morris, said, F it. I won't swear. I'm not a swearer usually. And he said, let's just release stuff to people to help. So if you find for your use case that tracking, right, scanning attempts to exploit this vulnerability works, they made those IPs available both in gray noise as well as just for free on GitHub, which is super nice. I will say that it's going to be really tough to keep up with all the IPs that are scanning this and determine if they're security researchers or bad guys, but worth a shot, right? And Gray Noise has validated a lot of these. And so really cool of them. Wanted to give them a shout out for helping. URL House is another source that is awesome. Again, this is crowdsourced, so folks can come in, crowdsource this. That said, this is another great source that if you're looking for, right, patterns of what kind of exploitation are we seeing in the wild, great source there. There's so many sources, right? If you're trying to figure out, are you vulnerable to this? Folks at Huntress, they're another great company who helps the community out. They released a vulnerability tester. So there's so many things out there to help. I know this is a lot. I know it's been a really wild week. So I think probably the most important thing to highlight is from Lit Moose on Twitter, who's an awesome incident responder who has probably been running around like wild over the past week. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I think that's really important because we suspect adversaries are probably going to continue exploiting this as long as it's not patched everywhere. So hang in there, right? Don't work 20-hour days and not sleep and not eat because, right, we need you as a defender to be okay. So yeah, she offers great recommendations, right? Rotate shifts, remember to eat and drink. I know it sounds silly, but I definitely didn't leave my house for a few days and forgot to eat breakfast. So it's important. And your personal health is more important than anything that is a computer, like humans before computers. That said, I know it's been a really tough week on everyone. So hang in there. And yeah, Log4j, happy end of 2021, everyone. I hope that some of these resources are useful. And again, I will put these up. We'll put these up in a blog post shortly for you all. With that, we are almost at the top of the hour, and I'm sure you all have things to get back to at work. So just as we wrap up, I just wanted to mention, if you like intelligence content, like nerding out about group names and stuff like that, the SANS Cyber Threat Intel Summit's coming up the end of January. We converted it to all virtual, and it's completely free. Totally free. So we'll include this link, and I think Viv and Steven's been dropping it throughout this live stream. But please sign up, join us virtually for free online at the end of January for the SANS CTI Summit. Should be a great time. We already have a bunch of great talks planned. And with that, that's all I got for you today, folks. Thank you so much for joining in. Appreciate Mike as well stopping by. With that, everyone, please take care of yourselves and have a really, really happy holiday. And we hope to see you in a future edition of the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. Take care, everyone.